welcome you to the Virginia Masonic University New Mason Curriculum, Entered Apprentice section. Now, brethren, we have a fine tradition in Masonry, and what a pleasure it is to share it and study it here together. Now, friends, what are we trying to do here? We're not trying to produce Masonic scholars with this program, but provide a well-rounded start that sparks an interest in studying Masonry. We're trying to create a desire in the Mason to study these things, whether it be history or philosophy or other subjects. Now, every man has a different interest in Masonry. It could be the ritual, it could be the history, the background, but we want each Mason to grab hold of something and learn from that and apply that knowledge in society, improve himself, and take that knowledge out and do good things with it. Now, this new Mason curriculum has a module for each degree: the Entered Apprentice, the Fellowcraft, and the Master Mason. Put all together, we've got a really interesting program for you, one that we've used materials from Acacia Lodge, from Fredericksburg Lodge, and from Herndon Lodge, from where I'm speaking to you today. So, brethren, having said that, let's go ahead and get into the philosophy of Masonry and begin our course. Now, there have been numerous definitions of Freemasonry over the years. There's a lot of ways to describe it, whether it's a fraternity or a community service or self-improvement, philosophical. But let me offer you a straightforward definition for today's class, and that's a system of moral philosophy, also known as ethics, using allegory and ancient symbols, some of which were used by the cathedral builders, or the operative Masons as we call them. Now, the tools and initiation rituals of operative Masonry have evolved to teach moral lessons on what's necessary to make a better man. Now, brethren, I'd like you to think about that for a little while. Think about what philosophy is all about, what it is we're trying to do with philosophy. Well, the Greek definition of philosophy means love of wisdom. And if you look back in the history of philosophy, we have been influenced by a lot of the great Greek philosophers over time. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, folks like that. You'll find evidence of that if you look at the cardinal virtues in the first degree: temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice. Now, those virtues are the virtues of the ancient Greek philosophers. So secondly, let's talk a little bit about Masonry as initiation and how the degrees symbolize the journey from ignorance to wisdom. And this is a metaphor for moving from darkness to light, darkness to Masonic light, as we say. Now, wisdom is more than knowledge. When knowledge is combined with experience, it produces wisdom, which gives us deeper insight into life. Now, beyond self-improvement, Masonry stresses basic virtues and truths that men have in common in order to build brotherhood. Now, there's always been some overlap between religious and moral philosophy because they both deal with right living. But Freemasonry, while religious, is not a religion. It has no dogma dealing with a man's personal salvation. It seeks to unite men from various diverse religious traditions, each of whom remains faithful to his own religious beliefs. Now, talking about Masonry as an initiation experience, what sets it apart is that it comes at a man's life when his thoughts turn to a more serious matter. Our statistics show us over the last 100 years in Masonry that that's usually in the mid-30s, quite often about the age of 37. And it's that time frame in a man where you start to think about, hey, what's really important in life? What is it I want to do? What do I want to reflect on? What do I want to be? That's moving towards middle age where you have these kind of thoughts. So having said all that, brethren, I'd like you to reflect a little bit, again, on the definition of Masonry, what it's all about, how you might define it, what we've talked about here, and I'll leave you for a moment to speak with your facilitator, and we'll pick right back up. Thank you. Brethren, let's talk a little further about the purpose of Masonry. What is it we're trying to accomplish with Masonry? Well, the purpose is to make good men better by building inner character and virtue using the unique rituals we find in Freemasonry. Ritual and the philosophy that goes along with it is the underlying foundation, and it's what sets Masonry apart from other fraternal organizations. Now think about that for just a second. Hundreds of years we've been doing this, millions of Masons. What a tradition that is, and what a unique way of teaching we have for you. Now, Freemasonry presents to the seeker a road to travel, an initiation that dramatizes the journey of life in search of truth and wisdom. In fact, Freemasonry is a way of life that improves a man from the inside out and ultimately contributes to a better society. And we build true friendship among men in this society, respect, toleration. These are some of the values that we have and the purpose we have for Freemasonry. Now, think about this a second. There are many ways to divide men: race, politics, religion, ethnic background. I bet you if we thought about it, we could come off with 10 or 12 very quickly. Now, Freemasonry focuses on what we have in common, and that's its great wisdom. We teach the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. And by modeling and practicing the ways things should be in the lodge, hopefully that begins to rub off on us and we practice that way outside of the lodge. In the end, this leads to a more civilized society. This is the sort of thing that we want to build up among our brethren as citizens. Rudyard Kipling was a famous Mason who was initiated in India, where there are many different religious traditions. And in India, they refer to the lodge as the magic house. They call it that because so many different men of different backgrounds and religions could come together in a solemn way under one roof and again, celebrate what they had in common, stress what they had in common. There's plenty of time in this world to talk about our differences. Here's the place where we come together. Brethren, I'd like to also add to you the basic tenets of Freemasonry. Now, those are brotherly love, relief, and truth. These are our three most abiding principles, if you will, in Masonry. And I'm going to take just a second to read them to you from our official ritual. Now, brotherly love, we say by the exercise of brotherly love, we are taught to regard the whole human species as one common family, the high, the low, the rich, and the poor, who, as created by one almighty parent and inhabitants of the same planet, are sent into the world to aid, support, and protect each other. On this principle, Freemasonry unites men of every country, sect, and opinion, and conciliates true friendship among those who might otherwise remain at a perpetual distance. Now again, this is the sort of thing that we are promoting, that we are believing in with Masonry. The second tenet is relief. To relieve the distress is a duty incumbent on all men, but particularly upon Masons, who are linked together by an indissoluble chain of sincere affection, to soothe the unhappy, to sympathize with their misfortunes, to compassionate their miseries and restore peace to their troubled minds, is the grand aim we have in view. On this basis, we form our friendships and establish our connections. Now, brethren, this type of relief can take many forms. It can be personal relief, where we simply listen to a brother and offer good counsel, hear what his problems are. Or it can be organized relief, such as we find in many of our philanthropies. Think about the Shrine or the Scottish Rite. These are great philanthropies we've built over time. All these things are examples of relief, and they're very important. Lastly, the tenet of truth is a divine attribute and the foundation of every virtue. To be good men and true is the first lesson we are taught in Masonry. On this theme, we contemplate and by its dictates endeavor to regulate our conduct. Hence, while influenced by this principle, hypocrisy and deceit are unknown among us. Sincerity and plain dealing characterize us, and the heart and tongue join together in promoting each other's welfare and rejoicing in each other's prosperity. Now, brethren, truth is an important virtue. Truth, I would compare that to integrity, character, to be good men and true. Can your word be trusted? Are you credible? Do you do what you say you're going to do? This is an important part of character, an important part of Masonry. So, brethren, let's close this section and talk a little bit about Psalm 133, which is the scripture that opens up the degree, is used in the opening prayer for the EA degree. How good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. This is a beautiful definition of love, really, which you'll find in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And I invite you to take a look at that. What a beautiful way to start off this degree, to set the tone of this degree. Brethren, lastly, I'd like to say we would recommend to you a book by Joseph Fort Newton, who was a Reverend Episcopal priest, who wrote a book called The Builders. Chapters 1 through 3 covers the spirit and philosophy of Masonry. I invite you to take a read of that. You will not find a better, more elegant speaker about the power and promise of Masonry than Joseph Fort Newton. The way in which he writes is very uplifting, and I think you'll be very interested to read what he has to say. Thank you, brethren, and we'll be back in just a minute. Brethren, welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit now about the history of Masonry. Now, we don't want to give you all of the history here in one setting for this EA module. We want to just give you an introduction to some of the more basic elements of our history, and then we can build on that in future modules. Now, our proven history comes from the operative Masons who built the cathedrals in England and Scotland in the Gothic style. And this is generally from 1150 to 1550, about 400 years. Now, lodges in those days had a constitution which defined the general rules of conduct. They had charges in the front which defined those rules, and they also often had a fanciful history about the history of the craft. Each lodge would have a manuscript, if you will, that was the charges that defined this. Now, the oldest one we know about is called the Regius manuscript, and it dates from about 1390. There are others, like the Cook manuscript, but they're all very similar, of an operative nature. So these are things that you can look up in the library or online and read them, and I think you'll be interested to see how they relate to our ritual now today. In particular, I would call your attention to the charge, which we have at the end of each degree. You'll notice in there the same language and some of the same basic points that we see in the manuscripts. Some of the historical evidence we have with the operative lodges includes minutes that go all the way back to 1599 and the lodge in Scotland in Kilwinnig. If you think about that, written records from the 1600s, all into the 1700s, hundreds of years ago, definite proof of how these lodges, while they started operative, eventually over the 1650s and late 1600s, they turned into speculative philosophical lodges. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the next module. But this is the written evidence we have, and I encourage you to take a look at it. Now let's move on and talk about another theory, which is some feel that Freemasonry descended from the Knights Templar. Now, what were the Knights Templar? Well, they were an order of warrior monks. This order was created in 1118 by Hugh de Pines and blessed by the church. And its primary job was to protect pilgrims who were coming down to visit the Holy Lands. Now, some have an interest in the connection with Masonry here, because what they see is that for a number of years, these knights, they set up their headquarters on the Temple Mount, where Solomon's Temple had stood. And there's some speculation as to, hey, maybe they excavated some of the ruins beneath. Maybe they found some treasures and things that were buried there. They were there for several years with only about 10 members until they really started to recruit and get a large force in the field. So this sort of circumstantial evidence leads some to believe that maybe they found something there and they had a mission there that was something more than just protecting pilgrims. It's hard to say beyond a circumstantial evidence, brethren, but it's a very fascinating subject. The fact is we don't have any hard evidence at present to show a direct connection between Masons and the Knights Templar. But with the circumstantial evidence, it's very interesting to study. One of the books that you'll probably want to take a look at in that is the book Born in Blood by John Robinson. This is an excellent book that lays out the evidence for this case. Now let's talk a little bit further about the actual history of the Grand Lodge and the formation of the first Grand Lodge in England. This was formed in 1717 in London by 4 local lodges meeting at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern. Now these lodges were among those still active after the massive rebuilding program after the Great Fire of London in 1666. Many of you may have heard of Sir Christopher Wren, who was one of the outstanding architects in English history. He was an operative Mason, a great architect, a past master of an operative lodge, and a past master of a speculative lodge. Many things came together in this one historic figure. He dedicated his great cathedral, St. John's, in 1708. And sometime thereafter, when a lot of this great rebuilding had been done after the Great Fire, we see these lodges really begin to turn to speculative nature. And in 1717, the Grand Lodge formed. Now from there, Masonry spread into Scotland, into Ireland, across Europe, and eventually to the colonies. The emphasis and flavor of Masonry in these different countries varied, but the explosion of it was an amazing occurrence. So let's wrap up there for a moment, and I would point your attention to a very good book called Freemasonry for Dummies. And this is by no means for dummies. We're talking about an excellent book by Christopher Hodap, and if you look in there, in Chapter 2, early chapters, you'll get a very good overview of Masonry. Also, I would point your attention to Henry Wilson Coyle's comprehensive view of Freemasonry. So let's take a little bit to discuss what we've covered in this time frame. Thank you. Brethren, we're next going to move to talk about some knowledge of the Entered Apprentice degree. From the start of a petitioner's process all the way through the degree, we're going to just talk about each stage of it and what we think that means. Now, we'll start off by saying, what is an entered apprentice? The term entered apprentice refers to someone who has received the first degree in Masonry. In the operative world, this is the first stage of learning where a young man must work hard to prove himself in his trade. This is one of many operative terms used by speculative Masonry. Now, a Mason must learn all the lessons of the first degree to proceed onwards, and a Mason is expected to abide by the rules of Freemasonry and show humility and industriousness to learn about this craft. Masonry really has a threefold plan when you think about it. The first degree of entered apprentice is concerned with governing the passions, basic morality and ethics, whereas the second degree has more to do with the attainment of useful knowledge, the adornment of the mind with useful knowledge, whereas the Master Mason's degree is more to do with the spiritual part of man. By putting these three things together, we have a very practical plan of life and self-improvement. So let's talk about early in the process the qualifications of a petitioner. The primary spiritual qualification is a man believes in a supreme being and the immortality of the soul. These inform the entire structure of Masonry and underlie all of it. In a philosophical sense, he's a seeker, somebody that really desires from his heart to find out more about himself and how to improve himself. And he's beginning a personal journey of self-improvement and spiritual growth. This sort of pursuit, again, is the goal of philosophy and is critical to being a better man. In addition, he must be a man of good moral character and free of any felonies. This is so that we can promote the viability of the brotherhood and the lofty ideals of our society. Now, the physical qualifications are, in Virginia, that a man must be 18 years of age and have no physical serious defects. And this is such that a man's old enough to make his own decisions in life and to realize the seriousness of what he's taken on. Now, is Masonry an exclusive organization or is it inclusive? What do you think it really is? We're starting with good men and we're setting the bar high for entrance, and then we're saying once you're in, you're going to have a fraternal feeling and friendship and brotherhood. I kind of liken it to the culture of the Marine Corps. They're looking for a few good men. It's hard to get in, but once you do get in, you know that you have friends and comrades that will be your brethren for life and that have your back in every situation. I think this is very similar to the culture we aspire to in Masonry. But I invite you to think about that further. Now let's move to preparation for initiation. Ideally, a candidate should find the door of Freemasonry on his own. It's that desire in the heart where he wants to improve himself that we want to drive the process. It's this turning of the heart that really begins the initiation, the change in his life. And that's why we say he's first prepared to be made a Mason in his heart. Now, the ceremonies are of a serious nature, as you've seen, dignified in their presentation, and designed to impart teachings that obligate a man to a better life. To get the greatest benefit from these ceremonies, a candidate should open his mind and prepare himself to absorb these teachings. And pay attention to what's going on around him, as I'm sure you did. It was a lot of information presented to you. These are unusual methods we use, and it may be a unique experience for you, but I think it's one that's very impressive on your mind. Now let's say one last thing about initiation. This is what we call a rite of passage as well. And I invite you to think about, how is this similar to other rites of passage that you may have experienced, such as in the military? When somebody makes the rank of Chief Petty Officer in the Navy, look at all the rituals there are for that. All the things he goes through and the honor that's bestowed upon him, that's a real turning point in his life and in his career. Or perhaps in the Jewish tradition, a bar mitzvah. Or even someplace far off, like Africa, where the Maasai warriors, the young boy has to participate in the killing of a lion to show that he's ready to pass on to manhood. All of these are rites of passage, and they show going from a boy to a man. Masonry is the same way. The tradition, the ritual that we have dramatizes all of that. So now as we go to a break, I invite you to think about that, how it's like other traditions, and we'll be back in just a minute. Brethren, welcome back. Let's talk now about the degree preparation, and let's pick up and talk about where the degree actually begins, in the preparation room. Now, if you'll recall back, you were provided with a set of plain garments. Now, what is that supposed to symbolize? Well, it talks about the same level that we're all on, and it stresses the value of equality. Masonry is concerned with the internal qualifications rather than his worldly wealth and honors. All men are received in the same manner to demonstrate this principle of equality. And that could be from every level in society, from the president right on down to the gardener. And I'll give you a good example of this. President Truman, in 1948, when he was running against Thomas Dewey, he reached towards the end of the campaign, and he was at a campaign stop, and it was a neck-and-neck race with Dewey. And he saw somebody in the crowd who had been a sailor on the presidential yacht, young man, and the young man's father was with them. And the young man's father mentioned to the president that they were going to do the son's Master Mason's degree that night, and would he like to join them? Now, if you can picture this, here's Truman in the race of his life just a few days before the election, and yet he took the time aside to go and visit with his family and to be there for that young man's Master Mason degree. That shows the uniting of men across all social strata, and there's real power in that, and I'm very proud of that example, and I like to think about that. Now let's talk a little further about the preparation. We're divested of minerals and metals. Now we say in the ritual that this is so we would bring nothing offensive or defensive into the lodge, and also symbolically we could say it's such that the candidate would not bring in any passions or prejudices into the lodge as well. The hoodwink. What does the hoodwink symbolize? It's the mystical darkness or ignorance of the uninitiated. It's removed at the right time when the candidate is ready to receive the light and knowledge of the degree. And it also symbolizes the veil of secrecy and silence surrounding the mysteries of Masonry. There is also there an element of trust. The candidate, as you will remember, you have to put your trust in the conductor as he takes you around the lodge. And we learn the virtue of trust there, that we can depend on our brethren to look after us. Now to the cable tow, which is draped around your shoulders. Sometimes it is viewed as the symbol of our Masonic values and obligations to one another. Sometimes it is portraying the binding element between all Masons, which we sometimes call the mystic tie. In common speech, we use it to talk about what's the reasonable effort that a man might put in to answer the call of a Mason who needs him. If somebody says, hey, we want you to come to this meeting, or we want you to help out, or I want you to help out with this, you think about it, hey, can I do it? My reasonable ability to do what a fellow brother is asking me to do, that's the length of my cable tow. Now we also go to the wearing of one shoe. And as we say in the lecture, this is evidence of sincerity on the candidate's part, shows that the candidate is serious about the business at hand. So now let's go to entering the lodge. Being duly and truly prepared also refers to the state of a man's heart as he seeks admission into our order. Ask and ye shall receive, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. As he enters into the lodge room, the young man is entering into a new world, the world of Masonry, leaving the darkness and ignorance, looking for the light, seeking the light which he finds in the east. This is not just some formality, but it's a genuine experience, an initiatic experience that you can feel impressed upon you as you're led around the lodge. The entered apprentice has got to be ready to work on his character and do those things that are going to make him a better man. Think about how you felt as you were in the preparation room and as you entered through the door and were led around the lodge room. What was on your mind? What did you expect to get from Masonry? How were you impressed by the ceremony? Did you find it hard to put your trust in others and your brethren? These are some good questions to think about for this section. Now, lodges are referred to as quarries because they are places of toil. Freemasonry offers no privileges or rewards except to those who earn them. It places working tools, not playthings, in the hands of its members. To become a Mason is a solemn and serious undertaking, and once the step is taken, it will change the course of your life, which I hope that you have seen in the time that you have been a Mason. Brethren, let's think on this for a moment, and we'll be back in just a minute. Now, brethren, here we are at the reception of the candidate in the lodge, upon the point of a sharp instrument, which is to impress upon you the necessity to preserve the secrets of the society, not as a literal penalty, but as an admonition that it should be a pain to your conscience symbolically if you should ever betray a trust. This is what we're trying to prove with the reception, demonstrating the virtue of trust, that you can be trusted with the secrets of the fraternity. In real life, that you can be trusted with other confidences and secrets that are given to you. This is an important part of your personal life and your work life. Next, you're taken to the center of a lodge and caused to kneel. We teach that no man should begin a great undertaking without first invoking the prayer and blessing of deity. Where do we get this inspiration? Well, if you remember back in the Bible to the building of Solomon's temple in 1 Chronicles, David offered up a prayer for his son Solomon, that he might be up to the task of building the greatest building in the history of the world. That building was going to require exact work and special emphasis to get it right. And so this is a great metaphor for us to talk about the building of character and virtue on our inside. If you think about that parallel, you can see how serious it is of what we're trying to accomplish. Now, I'll tell you something real quickly about Solomon's temple. It was more than just a church or a place to gather to pray. It was literally the dwelling place of God on earth. In the Holy of Holies, or Sanctum Sanctorum as it's called, this is where they believed that God dwelled right on top of the Ark of the Covenant. Only the high priest was allowed to go into that room once a year to speak the holy name of God. Now, if you can think about what a serious place this is the dwelling place of God, and what an immense task it was to build such a thing, you can see the motif that we have here. Next comes the rite of circumambulation, where the candidate is led, and where you were led once around the lodge to the junior warden in the south. This is walking around a central point or object, which in our case is the altar. It's performed in a clockwise manner, which mimics the movement of the sun, rising in the east to its zenith in the south, and then setting in the west. This symbolizes the candidate's journey. The kneeling at the altar for the obligation. Well, brethren, you know that the candidate is advanced and made an entered apprentice to kneel at the altar in the form of a dugard. The altar obviously symbolizes the presence of deity, and the placement in the center of the lodge symbolizes the place that God has in Masonry, right at the center of our lives. The candidate approaches the altar in search of light and assumes his obligation there. In the presence of God and his brethren, he offers himself to the service of the Supreme Architect and to mankind in general. It is a point on which life in our Masonic Lodge is focused, and it's therefore accorded the highest respect. Now, we obligate our brethren at the altar on the volume of the sacred law for the same basic reason as a witness is sworn in at court. so that he may take the business at hand in a most serious manner. In doing so, a man is laid under the most binding obligation possible to improve his morality, pursue virtue, and defend freedom of thought. It's not done to preach any religious doctrine or as a profession of a particular faith. It's critical to understand this. We're not here to expound a particular faith or denomination or plan of salvation. It's to lay the candidate under obligation to the seriousness of his pursuit to improve himself in character and virtue and morality. So with this in mind, brethren, I ask you to think about what we're doing with the obligation, what it is we've taken upon ourselves, and we'll be right back in a minute. Now, brethren, with the obligation, the candidate has solemnly bound himself to Freemasonry and assumed certain duties, which are his for the rest of his life. In addition to binding the candidate Freemasonry and its duties, it also protects the fraternity against someone revealing the secrets, the modes of recognition that we have. By doing all this, once again, we develop and demonstrate the virtue of trust. And this is important, again, at work, between friends and family. This is a real virtue. Now, just about everything about Freemasonry can be discussed with friends and family and others. And we should be proud to tell people of the ideals of Masonry, our history, what we're trying to do in terms of brotherhood, and so forth. But we do have certain secrets which are largely based around the modes of recognitions, the grips, signs, words, dewguards, and so forth, and the associated ritual with them. That is what we have obligated ourselves to protect. And in doing so, again, we demonstrate the virtue of trust. Now, the penalties in Masonry have inspired a lot of thought. Yes, they are of a grisly nature, and it leads one to think, well, where do they come from? Where do we get this type of tradition? And really, we find the answer in the Old Testament. A lot of the penalties and ways of making sacrifices and such that we find there are very similar to what we use in Masonry. Now again, they are simply symbolic, and they demonstrate the pain that you should feel in your conscience if you violate your obligation. In fact, in modern Masonry, there's only three true penalties, and that's reprimand, suspension, and expulsion from the fraternity. Again, these type of practices are ancient, they're historical. We find them in the Bible and in other places in history, and they still add to the color and the rich tradition of Masonry. And if understood in the right way, I think you should have no problem with them. Now let's talk about the three great lights in Masonry, the Holy Bible, Square, and Compasses. Now, we've already said the volume of the sacred law, no matter what the religion is an indispensable part of a lodge. The Grand Lodges of the United States use the Holy Bible as the traditional VSL on their altars, and that pays tribute to the Christian heritage of our lodges. Now, in our jurisdiction in Virginia, a candidate may request to have his own sacred book on the altar along with the Bible during his degree ceremonies. In lodges in other countries, it may be another book that's used on the altar, but nonetheless, the purpose is the same, and that's to lay a man under obligation to pursue the true tenets and work of Masonry in the serious business of which he's engaged. This flexibility with the volume of the sacred law is done so that men of various faiths are able to solemnly bound themselves together in this pursuit of moral improvement. Again, this is a central theme of Masonry, not done to make a theological statement, but done to join us together in a solemn way. Now, the volume of the sacred law can also represent God's communication to man through Scripture and inspired writings. Knowledge of God through revelation, in other words. You can compare this to another way that we can discover things about God and His plans, which is the book of nature. By observing the creation of man, which we are encouraged to do, or the creation of God, which we are encouraged to do in the second degree, we can learn a lot about how God built the universe and the characteristics of Him as a grand architect. But this first way with the Holy Bible and the Scriptures is through revelation. So these are two ways, in fact, to get a feeling, an idea for God's plan and how He works. The three great lights are also consistent with the three-tier system of Blue Lodge Masonry. And we see human nature divided in three ways: body, mind, and soul. In the same way, the three great lights are the guiding principles of three natures: square to the body, the compass to the mind, and the VSL for the soul. Now, the three lesser lights are the sun, moon, and worshipful master. No lights in the north, as we say in Solomon's temple. It was positioned so far north of the ecliptic that light could not come in that direction. And we say in the lecture that it symbolizes that the worshipful master should govern his lodge with the same order and regularity as we observe in the moon and the sun. These are the great lights and the altar and the VSL, and this is what a candidate kneels before as he takes the obligation upon himself. Now, once that's done, the candidate is taken to what we call the rite of salutation, where he salutes the junior and senior wardens. Now, this is done so that the candidate can show a proper respect for the leadership of the lodge. And there's a good lesson in this, and that's that one must learn self-discipline before expecting to lead others. Important lesson. Now, this is also a key part of the Entered Apprentice degree itself, where we're learning how to subdue the passions and govern them with reason. And this is critical for the candidate to proceed on to the second and third degrees and the lessons they teach. So let's go ahead and think about those things for a moment, and we'll be right back with you. Brethren, welcome back. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the lambskin or white leather apron at this part. Now, this is one of the most visible symbols of our fraternity, and it's at once an emblem of innocence and the badge of a Mason. Now, by innocence is meant clean thinking and clean living, a loyal obedience to the laws of the craft, and sincere goodwill towards all mankind. The badge of a Mason signifies, among other things, that Masons are workers and builders. Now, as you look at the way a stone building is put together, the blocks are carefully constructed and regulated so they'll fit together nicely. Then we think about what binds these stones together. If each stone represents a particular Mason, we have to have mortar to bind the stones together. Now, in the Entered Apprentice ritual, we are taught that it is to prevent daubing with, the apron is to prevent daubing with untempered mortar. What is untempered mortar? Well, it's mortar that's been mixed with an improper balance of water and lime and cement and sand and those things, so that it doesn't bind correctly together. That's untempered mortar. And as you think about that, each stone is an individual Mason, and those stones joined together. You know, the mortar of brotherly love, relief, and truth that binds together has to be in the proper mixture. There are many parallels like this in Masonry with the building arts that, when we reflect on, are very interesting. Now let's go on and talk about the rite of destitution, which occurs towards the end of the first section. Now here the candidate's taught a serious lesson, and that's to be on the lookout for people in need. It's designed to forcibly impress in your mind the habit of considering and reconsidering how you might truly assist those in need. And you have to think about it, you know, even yourself, although you may enjoy wealth and honor today, you could be in desperate need tomorrow. Now, I'll tell you, brethren, it struck me early on when I was a Mason. I was traveling on Highway 95, and I saw a car that was disabled on the side of the road, and I'd just been made a Mason. And there they were, two young females, flat tire, in obvious need of help. And something at that time just drew my mind right down to my Masonic ring, which is my grandfather's ring. I just took a quick glance at it, and I said, you know what, I've got to pull over. And I did that, and I pulled over, and I helped them, and did what I could. And this is an example of what we want Masonry to do, to start to inculcate in our minds these kind of values, to influence us to think, not just once, but twice and three times, you know, what could I do to help a person? What could I do to help this situation? This is the good influence we want Masonry to have in our lives. Now, when you're led from the lodge, you're brought back into the northeast corner of the lodge, and you're placed where we put the cornerstone, which is the first stone of a building. This is where the Mason begins to erect his own moral temple. And it's a very profound time. For that one moment, you stand there as the youngest entered apprentice in the lodge, right at the very beginning of building your character and beginning your Masonic journey. I encourage you, brethren, to think about, as you stood there, what was going through your mind and what did you expect to do from there, and how would things work out? It's a singular moment in your Masonic career. Again, I would emphasize the building metaphor. From the cornerstone to the blocks, the way each one of us is a block, a rough ashlar, and the tools you use to turn us into a smooth ashlar, the way those blocks can be bound together by the cement, the way the tools prove not just the stone, but the wall with the plumb and level and so forth. All of this has great meaning to the building of character and virtue. Now, the working tools you are introduced to are the 24-inch gauge and common gavel. The 24-inch gauge, as we talk about, is the one that teaches us to divide up our life and prioritize the way we go about life, whether it's work or service of God or rest. We want to have an ordered and regular life, and that sort of thing is important to lead a good life. The common gavel is to chip away at those imperfections in our heart, the vices and superfluities of life. That pretty much speaks for itself. So we say the speculative Mason uses the tools symbolically to chip away at the imperfections in his inner character so that he may seek moral improvement, and ultimately that he may be bound in brotherly love to his fellow man. The basic metaphor for the art of building is central to the teachings of Masonry. I'd like to call your attention to a particular book at this time by Alan E. Roberts called The Craft and Its Symbols. This book really brings to life some of these basic metaphors between character building and operative building, and I encourage you to take a look at it. So let's take a moment to pause, and we'll go on next to the lecture of this degree and just hit a few high points of the lecture that you received. Brethren, welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit now about the lecture of the degree, the traditional lecture. Now, the traditional lectures given to the candidate by the Worshipful Master are intended to elaborate certain phases of the ritual, giving a broader explanation of the ceremonies in order for the candidate to better understand the lessons of Masonry. Now, the 3 sections of the VMU New Mason curriculum that we're covering are intended to provide still more depth, bringing the latest scholarly perspective and understanding to our work, and to stimulate the discussion about what we've done and what we think it means. Now, I'll speak first about the 4 cardinal virtues, again, temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice, that are explained to you in the Entered Apprentice degree. As we mentioned before, these virtues were first taught by Socrates and Plato and have served right up to the present day. I'd like to invite you to think about men that you know that exhibit those virtues. For instance, you might think of George Washington and the virtue of fortitude. Think about all that Washington had to do to keep an army in the field against the British Empire. Think about all the battles he lost, the tough times he faced, and yet he persevered and kept that army in the field. This is an ideal example of the virtue of fortitude. There are many other men that you may have met in the course of life that demonstrate these others, prudence, justice, temperance. I invite you to think about that, because it's by observing these kind of men and the way they act and trying to emulate how they conduct themselves that we learn a lot about the right way to live. And hopefully we will see a lot of that in our lodge. Now, Freemasonry chose as its patron saints John the Baptist and John the Evangelist, to whom lodges in the U.S. are dedicated to. By doing this, it could be said that the patron saints belonged to a lodge and that it must have been in the city in which they lived, which is Jerusalem. By this tradition, all lodges symbolically come from one at Jerusalem, and also by tradition, every Mason hails from such a lodge. By claiming to come from this mythical lodge, he proves that he hails from a just and legally constituted lodge. Now, we also have dedicated our lodges to John the Baptist and John the Evangelist in our Christian tradition. Masonry, speculative Masonry, is formed by Dr. James Anderson and John Desagoulier. These early architects of speculative Masons were Christians. Anderson was a Presbyterian minister. So you can see the heritage of our lodge in that historical fact. Now, lodges in their layout are said to represent the world, an oblong square. Now, an oblong square is two perfect squares side by side to make a rectangle, extending from east to west and north and south from the center of the world up to the heavens, shows the universality of Masonry. Next, we talk about the covering of lodge, which is the canopy of heaven. Lodges being situated east and west in commemoration of King Solomon's temple, which commemorated the miraculous east wind that wrought the deliverance of the Jews after crossing the Red Sea. Now, the east of a Masonic lodge does not necessarily mean the point of the compass. East in the lodge is the station of the Worshipful Master, from whence he dispenses light and instruction to his brethren. Some lodges may actually have the Master sitting in another compass location, but the important point is the Master is symbolically in the east and can share that knowledge and symbolize the rising sun. Further instruction is given in the lecture regarding the supports of a lodge, those being the pillars of wisdom, strength, and beauty, which also relate to the three immovable jewels of the lodge, the square, plumb, and level. Now, the three movable jewels of the lodge, as we are taught, are the rough and perfect ashlar and the trestle board. The ashlars are very precise symbols of the process of initiation, the rough and crude nature of a man using the tools to chip away and to build that perfect nature. In ancient times, the trestle board was used by the Master to draw designs for the operative workmen to construct a building. The speculative mason uses the designs laid out in the volume of the Sacred Law as guidelines to build his inner temple of virtue. Now, the ornaments, as we're taught, are the mosaic pavement, the indented tessel, and the blazing star. We live in a world of opposites, good and evil, night and day, hot, cold, love and hate. The mosaic pavement symbolizes this fact. The indented tessel reminds us of the many blessings and comforts in our life, and the blazing star symbolizes deity. Lastly, we're given a word about entered apprentices engaging in the learning of Freemasonry with freedom, fervency, and zeal, represented by chalk, charcoal, and clay. Chalk freely marks everything it touches. Charcoal, when properly ignited, will melt most any metal. And clay constantly reminds a man that from it he came, so to it he must return at last. Now, lastly, brethren, in the degree, we're given the charge. And as I mentioned earlier, the material that's in the charge you may find in those ancient Gothic manuscripts, the Cook manuscript, the Regius manuscript. Very fascinating to see the language contained in these historical documents. The three main things that we talk about in the charge for the entered apprentice are the three great duties which you're told to practice and inculcate. First, to God, by only mentioning His holy name with reference, by employing His aid in your good works, and by esteeming Him as the chief good. Secondly, to your neighbor, by acting upon the square and doing unto him as you wish he would do unto you, the golden rule. And thirdly, to yourself, by avoiding all irregularity or intemperance which may impair your faculty or debase your profession. These three primary relationships, to yourself, to your neighbor, and to your God, these are very central to the teachings of Freemasonry and to the entered apprentice degree, and lay a solid foundation for your further progress in the craft. Some of the other charges you find, that to be a quiet and peaceful citizen, support your country, do not place yourself in situations which compromise your name or the fraternity, avoid arguments with folks that criticize the lodge through ignorance, to increase your knowledge about the fraternity in your leisure time, and to keep sacred the mysteries of the order. You're encouraged to have a zealous attachment to these charges so that you can make progress in Masonry. Brethren, this concludes the degree as it unfolds to you with the charge. Again, I'd like to encourage you to discuss with your facilitator what the charge is all about, what the lecturer is trying to teach us, some of the high points of it, questions you may have written down. And when we return, we'll depart from this area and we'll talk a little bit about the officers of the lodge, frequently asked questions, and philanthropy and Masonry. About Masonic protocol and etiquette. We're going to depart from the ritual and symbolism and talk about elements of a lodge and how it's run. First of all, let's talk about the officers. Now, the lodge is ruled and governed by a worshipful master. He is fully responsible for the lodge, similar to the captain of a ship. It's more than just the pay grade. It's all the tradition and authority that goes with it. But he must ensure that peace and harmony is maintained in accordance with the aims of the craft. Now, he's assisted by 2 wardens, a junior and senior warden, and those 3 officers together are called the stationed officers. They are in turn assisted by the senior and junior deacons. And if you put those 5 together, we call those the line officers, and they generally advance 1 year at a time. Hopefully, you've begun to think about the possibility of serving as an officer of some sort in your lodge. We add to these 2 the treasurer and the secretary, and these are all elected officers. Now, lastly, the other junior officers, be they stewards or marshal or others, are all appointed by the worshipful master for a given year and serve at his pleasure. Now, I invite you to think about the leadership module of the lodge, not the module, but the model of a lodge, and compare it to other organizations you may have been in, such as the military or business. Like the Navy, for example, the captain of a ship assisted by a commander, lieutenant commander. What do we have petty officers doing? What do we have warrant officers doing? There's a lot of things that you may have in your experience that you could compare. Now let's talk about the rights of an entered apprentice. Now these are limited since he cannot vote or hold office. The apprentice is not entitled to a Masonic funeral or organized Masonic charity, but this does not bar him from receiving assistance from a Mason as an individual. He can attend lodge in the EA degree. He has a right to be instructed in his work and in matters pertaining to this degree. That he has a right to. He may not receive the degrees of craft masonry elsewhere without the consent of his lodge. Finally, the entered apprentice possesses the modes of recognition by which he can make himself known to other Masons, other entered apprentices. Now, the responsibilities of an entered apprentice. He has very few actual responsibilities. He is obviously obligated to keep secret everything he has promised to keep secret and conduct himself with proper decorum. But it's really about diligently learning the work, being as involved with his work as possible to learn it. Not just the words, but more as deeply as he can absorb the symbolic teachings. For this reason, the Mason is not to be content with the letter and outward form of the degree, but to apply himself with this freedom, fervency, and zeal to sincere and thorough understanding of what the degree conveys. Now, there are some subjects not proper for discussion in the lodge, and 2 of the ones that leap right out at us are religion and politics. Why do we do this? Well, if you think about what we're trying to promote, friendship, morality, brotherly love, religion and politics are 2 of the things which can spoil the brotherhood right away. For example, suppose we're in a lodge together, and I happen to casually mention that I'm the Southwest regional fundraiser for Hillary Rodham Clinton, and that I believe in that work greatly. Regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, that sort of introduction of politics can put a wedge between the brother right away, between the brethren. Same thing with religion. Could be a particular denomination or faith. These different things divide the brethren and spoil what we're trying to accomplish. And so we ask brethren to leave those at the door. Our objective is to create harmony among the brethren and unite them rather than divide them. Now let's speak a little bit about the worshipful master in particular. Why is the presiding officer of the lodge called worshipful? Well, this is an old English word meaning worthy of respect. You still see this term used in England and Canada, like the Lord Worshipful Mayor of London, but to the American ear it's very strange. Nonetheless, it simply means honorable. Why is this station in the east? Well, in the world of nature, the sun rises in the east to shed light on the earth, In a like manner, it is expected that the master in the East should be the source of Masonic knowledge for his brethren. Why does he wear a hat? As we've described in the lecture, he wears a hat as King Solomon and other kings wore a crown as a mark of dignity. Keeping the head covered while others are uncovered has long been a symbol of superior rank, and men as a mark of respect usually uncover in the presence of those they deem to be of a superior rank. The title master is not unlike the master of a ship or one who has received a master's degree in his chosen discipline. The master is deemed capable of teaching his subject Freemasonry and imparting light or knowledge. In addition, the wisdom of the master is said to flow from his station in the East to the volume of the sacred law on the altar. So in this way, no one should ever cross between the master's station and the altar when a lodge is in session. Brethren, I'd also like to take a moment and cover philanthropy. Community service, philanthropy, this has long been an important part of Masonry from our origins in England all around the world. Masons in this country are well known for contributing over $2 million a day towards charity. For example, Blue Lodge Masonry is known for its support of Masonic homes, childhood ID, and blood donation. The Scottish Rite operates many clinics for children with language disorders. The York Rite provides assistance to those who face loss of sight due to the need for surgical treatment and provides funds for research in curing diseases of the eye. But brethren, the largest Masonic philanthropy is the Shrine Hospital System that operates 22 hospitals across North America with an annual operating budget of over $750 million a year. Now, what do all those hospitals have in common? Not one has a billing department. The Shrine has helped over 800,000 children since 1922 with the latest technology in orthopedics, burn treatment, and other services. Now, I invite you to reflect on the importance of philanthropy, on what we do as Masons, how we make that happen, whether it's the Shrine or the local Blue Lodge, what we're trying to accomplish there. And I invite you to read a book by a famous Mason, Brent Morris, called Masonic Philanthropies, that outlines all of that kind of aid that's given by Masons. Now, brethren, I will close with this section by saying that if you look in your handout, you will see a list of frequently asked questions that I invite you to peruse on your own time and look at the answers given and discuss with your facilitator as we close. So, brethren, that concludes the Entered Apprentice module for the New Mason section for the Virginia Masonic University. I'm glad you joined us here today, and I hope that you have gotten something out of this session. I hope that it's touched you in some way, and most importantly, I hope that it has stimulated inside of you the desire to further study Masonry, whether it's the history or the philosophy, the community service. Each one of us has something that we find particularly interesting about Masonry. And I hope you'll just go and spend that extra time to learn about it and put it into practice at your lodge, at home, and out in society. This is what we hope to accomplish with the VMU, and I thank you very much for your time. And please write to us with any questions at the Grand Lodge that you may have regarding this course or suggestions for improvement. I thank you, and God bless you.